Today, I want to talk a little bit about something that has been going on during this time of the pandemic, the racism that's been brought up and talked about a lot in our country and really in the world. And I've been having a lot of thoughts about it and would like to share a few of them with the hopes that maybe we could consider maybe a different perspective or help process some of the things that we're all struggling with, or many of us are struggling with regarding racism. And with this pandemic, I think we still have some restrictions in how we're able to process all these events. So I wanted to look at the pandemic less from the social, most of the talk I've been hearing about has been about the social structures that have been fostering racism, and talk more about the psychology, a little bit about the psychology of racism, and also the how does racism look to God? How does it fit in light of our relationship with God? The racism with respect to psychology, the way I understand it is that it is very much in our human nature to have biases. And most of our biases are benign. So we have biases of food, of friendship, of activities, of clothing, where we want to live. Most of those things really don't cause a problem for most of us when we prefer one thing over another. Where a bias becomes a problem is when we are biased in our relationships with people. And that bias looks like preferring one group of people over another group of people. So what we see in a bias or prejudice or discrimination against certain people is that one group is preferred over another. And so one is considered positively and the other is considered relatively negatively. And that always comes together. There's always the good compared with the bad, or the better compared with the worser. So when we have that happening, even those of us who don't believe in God, we recognize there's something wrong about that. Most of us recognize there's a problem there, because at some level, most of us recognize that all human beings have an equality of value. We're not equal in our circumstance. We're not equal in our talents or in our intelligence, but we are equal as far as value is concerned. And so when we see, at some level, we are able to recognize that when there is a bias or discrimination against one group of people over another, one preferred over another, then we recognize that as a problem because it goes against some sort of a deep sense that we are all equal. When that happens, when we do have that happen, and all of us have that to some extent a little bit, is that where that comes from has to do with what is often called in psychology a kind of a cognitive distortion. Cognitive distortions come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, a lot of different intensities and forms. There are several examples of what would be called a cognitive distortion, such as black and white thinking, emotional reasoning, overgeneralization, and what I think is exhibited in racism, labeling. When you think of the various forms of cognitive distortions, for me, they seem to really boil down to are two primary components. One component is that we think we know more than we do. And the other component is that we judge based on what we think we know. So what we do in psychotherapy when we try to address people's cognitive distortions, regardless what they're having distortions about, is that we try to help them recognize other information, other sources of experience, to put into context and to open up their limited perceptions, their limited restricted and restricting knowledge so that it opens up and they're able to have more knowledge, more understanding. And so their judgment based on that knowledge is more informed and more accurate, more true to reality. And that is, I think, very much what is going on with racism. When we, for an example, judge a race of people of a certain color based on, let's say, things we've heard in the news, or few experiences that we've had, or judging them according to certain expectations of how we think people should be culturally, or what their priorities should be, we are basically judging based on a very limited knowledge of that group. If the information is coming out of news as opposed to our experience, our relationships with people of that race, then we are not really availing ourselves of the experience and the knowledge of that people group, because we are sort of already making our decisions and our judgments based on a very limited piece of information. So if I were, for an example, to have had a very bad experience with a man who assaulted me, and out of that I conclude that all men are bad and that they are all dangerous to me, what that does is it does two things. It basically judges a whole group of people, a whole people group, even though there was really one person who assaulted me. And I take that knowledge from that one experience, I carry it over to all men in my life, and that basically vilifies them, and it also very much restricts my world. My relationships with men become very damaged, very limited, very negative as a result of my judgment based on my very limited knowledge. Psychotherapy tries to open up our limited knowledge in general, whatever our cognitive distortions are, so that they're not so distorted and we're able to perceive more based on reality. How does this relate? How does racism relate to our relationship with God? With God, there are two very fundamental truths that we know regarding our relationship with God that really, I think, help us have an understanding of what racism is and what it expresses and how to respond to it. One is that we read in the Bible, and some of us can say that we also can know just from a certain understanding based on our experience that God is the source of all, that God is the creator of all people, and that all people are 100% equally made by God and 100% equally made in his image. So in that regard, God is our creator, and God is the one who fashions us in his image, is the great equalizer. So there is no preference for God of one person over another. I want to read a verse from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 10, verse 17, where God explains to Israel that the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God who does not show partiality or take a bribe. God is up there. He's Lord of lords. He's God of gods. He's alone up there. And he has no partiality. He does not show partiality or take a bribe. No matter how rich we are, we can't pay our bail with God. He accepts us based on his impartial acceptance of us. The other truth that is very foundational is that we are all, as people, we all have the same parents, Adam and Eve. We all are made of flesh and blood. We all have the same human nature. And that does not, that basically, again, equalizes, if not our actions, certainly our potential. We all have the same potential to do and to be whatever we are, whatever our circumstances maybe encourage us to do or be. But the potential, the nature is equal among all of us. So given that, what that expresses is that we all have the potential for bias, because all human beings do have biases. All human beings have the potential for racism. Given that we all have that potential and some of us act on it, what that does is change the conversation and change the dynamic among ourselves. It's no longer a matter of, I'm racist and you're not, but it's a matter of, I'm racist and I express my racism, and you are racist and you don't express your racism. But it's understanding that the potential for racism is in all of us, that would allow us to have a conversation that I believe would result in something that would be a whole lot more effective and resolving of where we are stuck in the division we are stuck in now. Now, at the same time, when we come together, God always has to be a part of that picture. If we can look at the Tower of Babel that's described in Genesis chapter 11, and we read there how the people came together, but they came together without consideration of God, and so God in his mercy separated them, because he knows that when we all come together without reference to God, there is danger. Our human potential for good and for evil will come out. And so God doesn't want that good and evil potential to come out, because it will become self-defeating. We're a house divided apart from God, basically. We need him. So with God, and specifically we read in the New Covenant, the New Testament, with Jesus, we are enabled to be made one in him. That is a central part of the good news of the gospel. Jesus says in his prayer to God his Father in John chapter 17, verse 21, he says he prayed to God his Father that they all may be one. He's speaking of believers in this, and yet we know in other portions of Scripture that Jesus spoke of the Good Samaritan to also speak of our need to be neighbors towards others, to care for others, to respond to others in the ways we want them to respond to us. Why? Because we are ultimately the same. We all have the same nature. So once we become Christians, once we believe in Jesus, does that mean that our tendency toward racism will disappear? We see that in the early church, all the early believers sold their properties and they shared their wealth with one another, with that expressing in that they recognize their commonality, that mine is yours and yours is mine. And in that regard, they really did seem to express, to recognize, and to express the beauty of the gospel that brings us together. At the same time, though, it doesn't seem like it really got rid of our human nature toward racism or toward division, because we read in the book of Acts chapter 6 verse 1, shortly after they came together with their properties, that there were the leaders, the Jewish leaders of the church were preferring the widows from Jerusalem to serve them meals over the Jewish widows from the Greeks, among the Greeks. So right at the very beginning, we see that remains. Our tendency, our human tendency remains. And we also see that with Paul having to confront Peter. We read in Galatians chapter 2, verse 12, because Peter, a prominent leader in the early church, was afraid of the Jewish believers, and he shied away from the Greek believers because he didn't want to be disapproved of by the Jewish believers. So from the beginning, we see that this is an ongoing presence that we as Christians and really we as human beings need to be aware of, that exists in each and every one of us. And for us to really be able to have an honest conversation and to really address the damage and the destructiveness of racism, the only hope we have of resolution is if we all take responsibility. Do we all take blame for horrible things that happen, like with George Floyd? No, we don't all take blame. It wasn't George Floyd's blame, his fault that he was killed that way by the police. But we all need to take responsibility for the solution. If we don't, it won't happen. We won't have a solution. So I pray that this conversation can go in the direction of a resolution, in the direction of us coming together before God, as a country, as a world, really. We all need him. So, but I pray that there may be some words in what I shared today that can speak to your concerns about this issue, and that the Lord God keep you and me safe this week in him.